It's not a poll. It's not questions about how people feel. This is empirical data. And the interesting thing about that is, not having an objective, academic, empirical index is that, number one, it's somewhat fascinating when the numbers come out and you see things that you didn't expect. So that's how it should be. And so I think when people see this, they're going to find it that way. But it's shocking that there's never been one of these before. So I think the result of this is going to be, number one, everybody in every state is now going to be able to compare their state with all the other states as to which legal safeguards exist in their state and how they're doing compared to other states. That'll be new. I think number two, those who aren't in the top, maybe 10 or 5 or whatever, are probably going to immediately have some questions. You're going to have legislators, you're going to have citizens, you're going to have leaders say, hey, wait, why are we not higher on this list? And I think it's going to lead to people filling in gaps of protections that they didn't have. So that's a good thing. And then lastly, I think every year as we update this each year, it's going to cause us to talk about our first freedom. Many of the people who came to found this country did so for religious freedom, and it's one of the differentiators of this country from the rest of the world. And so I think it's a great discussion to have every year, as well as to look at the data and compare our states. So as somebody who's been doing this battle for 33 years trying to advance religious freedom, this is fun to see this day, and I think it's going to be great for our country. And so I'm going to pass it on to Trey, who heads the CCRD, to kind of get things going for us today. Thanks, Trey.
All right, my name is Trey Dimsdale, and it's my privilege to introduce you this morning to the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy and to the Religious Liberty in the States project. The CRCD was founded in October 2020 as an initiative of First Liberty Institute in response to a need for principled, rigorous academic engagement in our space. The name is conceptually borrowed from the work of Alexis de Tocqueville. It is religion that provides a people with a moral vocabulary from which the values, ideas, and mores shape the institutions and cultural artifacts of a society. And when those are properly cultivated, those give rise to the institutions of democracy that mark what we know broadly as civilization. Civilization, therefore, is dependent upon religion, religious people, religious ideas, religious convictions, and religious institutions. There is no other vehicle into the public square for these things than the vehicle of religious liberty. This is why understanding the landscape and the legal infrastructure that creates space for religious people of all faiths, or the non-religious of no faith, to enter into public life fully human and free to orient their lives in accordance with their deepest held beliefs about the nature of reality, of God, and of life itself. This project is hopefully a useful tool to all those who engage these questions, and so we are pleased to present it to you today. I have known the director of this project for many years, and when our COO, Dave Holmes, who's here with us this morning, cast a vision to me for the domestic religious liberty index, I knew that there was no more qualified, principled, and capable scholar than Dr. Sarah Estelle to design and execute this project. Dr. Estelle holds a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia. She serves as an associate professor of economics at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and is a research fellow for the CRCD. She's accomplished a Herculean task in completing the first edition of this project in just 1 year. And I speak for all of us at FLI and at the CRCD when I express sincere thanks to her for her tireless, careful work on this project. Sarah, thank you for being here, and thank you for presenting this to us this morning.
It is an absolute pleasure to be at this stage in the process where I can finally tell you the results. It's been a difficult thing at times, not letting in on the interesting and surprising results that we'll see at the top and the bottom of the ranking. I am also very happy that I've been given 3 hours so that I can unpack all of the methodological intricacies and the statistical hijinks that have occurred over the last year. Or maybe that was just one of the many dreams I've had over the last year working so tirelessly on this project. You start to dream about it. But I realize I have 20 minutes for my opening remarks. That being said, I do want to be clear about the carefulness with which we have approached this project, because we do believe it's such an important topic. So I will say a few things about our methodology. But first, the impetus for this project. The goal was to, in an empirical and credible, objective way, to measure the interstate variation in the legal landscape facing people of faith or no faith at all. We think this project has implications for broader conscience concerns as well. And to do this well, and I am an economist, so let me be clear, measurement really matters to me. Not just that we do measure, but that we measure well. We wanted to start with some important principles. I would say that what animates this project is an appreciation of pluralism. That we live in a pluralist society, that pluralism has benefits for our society is at the very root of this project. In order to talk to people across different faith traditions, or again, no faith tradition at all, we want to maintain the objectivity of this project. I think this is one area that my economic training and empirical work benefits this project. Is I have a clear idea on the front end of what it's going to look like to measure something that is in some cases rife with controversy and certainly touching on deeply held beliefs that are often in conflict in our society, but to do so in a way that we can say, here's what we're measuring, here's how we're measuring it. And so if you disagree, please engage in this conversation. To make that possible, transparency has been key from the beginning as well. So what you'll find on our website, religiouslibertyinthestates.com, is absolutely everything that you could need to understand how we came to our ultimate conclusions, whether it's the scores and the rankings, but also my research assistant, Cameron Zeller, who's here today, and my decisions as to how we ultimately scored each of the elements of the data that's provided there for you in detail. So transparency is important here. We expect that it will have both evaluative and generative benefits for this project. We want your feedback, and we want you to take the data and do more with it as well. So just a few words on methodology in the form of how we selected the data that ultimately we're focusing on this year. I want to be very clear up front that we did not enter into this project with a predefined list of the topics or the areas of life even where people are living according to their religious beliefs or faith. We allow states themselves to indicate where they're undertaking legal, statutory actions in order to protect religious liberty by using words like religion or religious exemption or conscience, where they've defined conscience to include not just philosophical but also religious beliefs. And so where any state indicates that they have an exemption, say, that is motivated by religious concern, we then turn to the remaining states to see if they have a similar statute in place. That allows us, again, to maintain our objectivity, but is also very important when we note that there are no really comprehensive data sets that include all the data that we've had to pull together. And so we do worry, right, that we might miss something if we don't have a very systematic way of looking to the states to indicate to us where there's something important there to measure. Now, one of the complications of this project is that we can't just turn to the letter of state law. That's primarily what we're doing, but we also have to consider the federal context. For it is the case that there are different laws across different states that really are superseded by federal decisions and regulations in certain areas of life. So I'll give an example of private school funding. It is unconstitutional to treat religious private schools differently than non-religious private schools, as has been decided even recently in multiple Supreme Court cases. Even if a state has in the letter of its law that it does treat them differently, that's no longer legal. To the extent that they do that, that's breaking the law as opposed to having different statutory guidelines. Those have been superseded by those decisions. And so my research assistant and I, we've had to study quite a bit of the federal context. I want to be clear that that is important to our understanding of the variation that exists across states. And ultimately, we land on a desire to primarily stick to state statutes, analogous sorts of constitutional provisions. The written letter of the law is, let me be clear, not the end-all be-all, right? It is an important element, a critical element to the experience of people with religious liberty. Our neighbors' attitudes matter too, right? Our day-in, day-out experiences. The decisions of judges and courts matter as well. But an advantage of looking at statutory law is that it is written, it's available to everyone, aiding our desire for transparency. And I think a bonus, although this wasn't the driving factor, but really a bonus now as we go into this next stage of sharing with you all of this information, is where states are not reaching their potential. We know where they can improve. Right? We've got the letter of the law, and not only that, we have the letter of every state law related to these items that I'll present momentarily, so that states can see the feasibility of implementing similar laws where they don't exist already within their state. And so this is the focus, not to say that it is our understanding that religious liberty only relies on state legislators, but certainly that's an important element. And so as we think about the frontier or ideal of what a state can accomplish, keep in mind that that has been defined based on what the set of 50 states have themselves demonstrated, right? So every element that we're looking at has been indicated by at least one state as something that they found apparently useful and necessary in their context. So given that data selection process, we land on primarily what we're calling 11 safeguards. Although some of these safeguards align themselves into topical areas that we're referencing as groups, and some of these safeguards are measured in multiple elements. So if you can see the slide here in the first column, our 6 groups. Do religious people have an opportunity to vote absentee if, say, Election Day falls on a religious holiday? Are there non-medical exemptions available for childhood immunization requirements for school-age children? Are there conscience provisions for those who work in healthcare provision? Is there an exemption to a health insurance contraceptive mandate? Can people of conscience who find themselves in disagreement with or having difficulty with a marriage or wedding ceremony, are there alternatives, including for public officials who might pass along their role of licensing a marriage to a deputy, for example, or in the case of one state where for-profit businesses are extended the right to conscience, so they do not need to participate if it goes against their conscience. And finally, the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts that 23 states have in place. These are in ways analogous to the federal RFRA, but necessary in light of federal decision that shows that federal RFRA does not apply to state jurisdictions. And so what you'll see in terms of the overall scores and rankings are a reflection of these 11 safeguards taken all together. And we can think of the percentage scores as indicating the percent of these 11 potential safeguards that a state has actually undertaken. So before I get to the rankings, let me say a little bit about the overall results. And you'll notice that I put a positive spin on absolutely as much as I can. So I'll say it this way: there's room for improvement. All states can do better. Let me show you the distribution of states. In this figure, the vertical axis is the count of the number of states, and the horizontal axis, the score on religious liberty in the states 2022. And first, you might notice that there's a wide range, that the top 2 states are there at 81 and 82%. Again, everyone has room for improvement, but they really set themselves apart. in comparison to those in the 16, 17, 18% there at the bottom. But even the vast majority of states that are providing less than 50% of the apparently feasible safeguards of religious liberty. Another way to look at this is according to the population in the United States and how they're distributed amongst the states that have clear variation in the safeguards they're providing. So this is a cumulative distribution of scores where the vertical axis shows us the percent of the US population that is living at or below the percentage of safeguards illustrated on the horizontal axis. Okay, so the point that I've labeled there with the 35% and 0.5 means that half of the US population is living with 35% or less of the potential safeguards of free exercise that we've looked at. If you follow the curve further along, you will notice that 80% of Americans are living with 50% or less of these safeguards. So that gives us the overall picture, but I think the question I've been asked most frequently over the last year, including well before I even had a clue who was going to come out on top of this ranking, is who wins, right? So who wins? Let me announce the top two. Coming in second place with 81% of the potential safeguards is Illinois. And edging Illinois out slightly with 82% is Mississippi. Both Illinois and Mississippi have relatively rare general health care conscience provisions. There are only 5 states in the United States that have these. They allow any health care practitioner in any procedure to live according to conscience. Mississippi's is more generous, more all-inclusive in terms of the exercise of religion, and that it is not limited by medical emergency. Mississippi also has some unique contributions in terms of our understanding of the feasible safeguards, in that they have taken big steps in terms of safeguarding free exercise for religious, for clergy and organizations and marriage and weddings, but also for-profit businesses and public officials. But I would encourage you to look more into these 2 states in particular, as they do set a good role model. They're not perfect. There's room for improvement, for sure. But on our website, religiouslibertyinthestates.com, we have 2 blogs posted there already that detail how they arrived at these scores. And we invite researchers and interested citizens to dig in further. How was it they were able to accomplish this? Not just what have they done, but how have they done it? What about the rest of the United States? Now, I'll say that those of you who are joining us via live stream have a slight advantage, because you might already be on the website and see the brilliant work of Brilliant Webworks, our web designer, who have given us this wonderful heat map of sorts. It's right at the top of our homepage, and on the website it's interactive, so your mouses should be hovering over different states at this point and seeing what their ranking is. But for those of us who are here in person today, I'll direct you to the last page of the paperwork on the right-hand side of your folder if you're interested. The full 50-state ranking is listed there for you, or you can look at the map and note that deeper shades of blue are indicative of greater amounts of safeguarding. So maybe we're looking at our own home states, maybe we're looking at our rival state. That's good, that's fine, you can do that. Look at your rival state, see if that encourages some important advocacy. Maybe you're looking for the lightest colored states, okay? Trying to keep things positive, we need to call things good that are good, and things that aren't so good, not so good. Here are our bottom 3 states, again, each having less than 20% of the feasible safeguards. Number 48, California, number 49, West Virginia, and number 50, New York. I think one piece of hope that I take away from the overall ranking is that religious liberty in practice is not a partisan issue. We have red and blue states at the top. we have traditionally thought of red and blue states at the bottom. And the fact that regardless of how a state goes in presidential politics or other elected offices, that there are states setting an example of how to do the tough work of codifying safeguards of free exercise, suggests that other states can get to work on this as well. And maybe this is a point of hope in general for our times, which so many people are suggesting are highly polarized. So I want to encourage you to learn more. There's our website one more time. Let me tell you a little bit about what you'll find there. And it is intentionally set up to be accessible to different audiences that will have different uses for this project. So one thing you'll find is a scorecard for each of the 50 states. Not coincidentally, formatted in a way that can be folded in thirds and put in an envelope and sent to your state house if you would like, or sent via email. This will be great for people that are primarily interested in what's going on in their state, or comparing to a rival state, or seeing how could we do better in light of these state-based kind of focus. Others will be interested in particular dimensions of our data. And so we have safeguard pages, each with sortable tables that include not just whether a state is safeguarding effectively with these check marks, but also how they're doing that. One of the contributions of this research, I would assert, is bringing together detailed data on what states are doing and how they're doing it. And states are finding different ways to provide safeguards in some of these dimensions. So there is a diversity of approaches that can be employed here. And that the table is sortable, I think, helps us group states according to how they're accomplishing these safeguards. And then I've used the word tireless once, which I meant to apply to our whole team for sure, but I have to give a special credit to research assistant Cameron Zeller for her assistance in pulling together all of the information on where these laws exist. So on our website, we have the citation for the law in statute or constitution of the state, as well as a hyperlink to that location. So if you want to see the letter of the law, you can go directly there from our website. Also available on our website is a detailed report. I know many of you have on your to-do list now for this afternoon 2,500 words on what we mean by liberty. Very important. Or maybe you'll be poring over the data set, which is available in an Excel spreadsheet, again, with all of our reasoning behind the codes, as we call them, and the scores that we've put together that comprise the index. We'll be keeping track of news items related to this project. Very soon you will see a post there that we've written to help people understand how this project will change in light of the Dobbs decision. I'm very pleased and glad to say that our methodology is well poised to adjusting to any sort of devolution of power to the states. States get to speak into what is relevant to religious liberty as well, and so we don't necessarily have to dip our toes into deciding what is good and true and right. We allow states to say, here's where our citizens expect to have their conscience protections in place. And so we've already begun thinking about that for religious liberty in the states 2023. And finally, let me say, I want to encourage anyone who has comments, questions, concerns, ideas, new items you'd like to see in the data, or ideas of how we might apply even these data, please contact us. The website gives a lot of opportunities for that, including media interest. We have folks on our team that are ready to respond very promptly. So I look forward to our discussion today. I thank you all for being here in person and via live stream to hear about this project.
Amazingly enough, and I think this is a testament to. I think the mic's on. Mic's off. Okay, sorry. I'm a negative example of what to do sometimes. You can learn from that too. So even at the bottom, there's something to learn about what not to do. Yeah, it's a testament to, I think, the work ethic of the team, and Sarah especially, that we're on time in terms of the overview of the agenda for things today, this morning. So it's my pleasure to introduce myself and the rest of the panel for the concluding part of our discussion during this session. My name is Jordan Baller. I'm Director of Research at the CRCD, and I've had the great honor and privilege of helping Sarah along with this project. To my left is Sam Goldman, a professor of political science here at George Washington and director of the Loeb Institute, and our host for this morning. It's out of his generosity that we're able to have this launch event here at George Washington. And then to his left is Sarah Estelle, the director of the project. So first, and given that we've stayed on time, I want to give Sarah a little bit more time to talk about methodology. And I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit more about how you and Cam moved from words on a page or words in a PDF or words on a website, wherever states are putting their laws these days, to numbers that you can actually put into an index? So how do you move from those words to numbers that can be indexed?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that, and I happen to have a slide prepared, just in case I had an opportunity to talk more about methodology. We've thought about this a lot, right? Because laws, in the strictest sense of the word data, laws are data, but they're clearly not the kind of data that lend themselves well to aggregation. Ultimately, we need to get numbers that can be added together. And that's not as straightforward as it might seem at the start. And so I do want to start at the beginning of what's been necessary for this process. So first, I want to give just the most sincere, deepest gratitude to the CRCD and First Liberty for providing the just ideal context of just freedom of academic inquiry. It's been fantastic. In fact, without requesting it, the invitation for this project actually specifies that I am allowed to follow best practices and the results will be what they will, right? That there may be copy editing, thank you for catching my typos, but no affecting of the rankings. And so I think that's key, that we have not had the results in mind from the beginning. I think the surprises at the top and the bottom might indicate that that is true. The decision that we made to allow states to speak, I would say initially, looking into the letter of the law and seeing what was available to us, that was a very practical decision. States, as you might imagine, and many of you know far better than I because you're legal practitioners, have not structured their laws similarly. It's not that you can turn to Chapter 2 and find childhood immunization in every state's laws. It's really quite a task to dig through what is available there. So that practical decision has allowed us to remove our hands entirely from deciding what is really a free exercise issue. What areas of life are relevant to people living according to conscience? It would be my firm stance that limiting religious liberty to some notion of freedom to worship is just far too limiting. We just don't even use that language in the report or in this project. We've had to be careful thinking about what does it mean where states are inactive, where they don't have a safeguard because they're not really doing anything in that space. And so one might think, well, maybe that because they're not active in that area, there's no risk factor for people of religious belief in that space. But in some cases, it is true that federal decisions, right, have set a context that at least some states have interpreted as providing risk within their jurisdiction. So I offer as an example Mississippi, our #1 state, who has done a lot in the area of marriage and weddings, although they have none of their own unique anti-discrimination law related to marriage and weddings. Their anti-discrimination law is limited to issues of disability. However, they have undertaken the tough work of codifying laws to provide that exemption, again, even going so far as to name for-profit businesses. So we've been thoughtful about each case of a missing exemption. Is it truly missing or is it not needed? And those of you who will be reading the report, you can turn to table 3 in the report and we address each of those in turn.
Understanding the federal context is part of that process, but also, as I mentioned earlier, part of understanding too whether the apparent variation in state laws is real variation. States don't always move immediately to have their laws reflect what is currently known to be the law of the land, and so those letters are not indicative of what's true on the ground or what's informing what happens in courts of law. Two more things I'll mention. I've already mentioned how much I've enjoyed writing an appendix on what we mean by liberty. This too is a bit of a practical concern. We need to think carefully about what liberty means because people have different views of what liberty is. And in some cases, they're confronting or conflicting with each other directly. So the example I use in the report is about an imagined Muslim owner of a butcher shop. He wants to have a halal butcher shop, and in order to do so, he must hire Muslims. Imagine that there is in the neighborhood a Christian butcher, and she feels that part of her right to free exercise is to be able to live into her calling to be a butcher. If she goes into the halal butcher shop and presents herself as a protected class because of religion as an employee, is she making a religious liberty claim? Yes. Is the owner of the butcher shop making a religious liberty claim when he says, I'm sorry, I can't hire you according to conscience, I can't provide the service to my customers who require not just certain tasks be accomplished in the back room of this butcher shop, but that the beliefs that are held by the employees are according to Islam. So these directly confront each other. Again, in the report we cover in far more detail, but I'll let you know that ultimately when we think of concepts of what some would call negative liberty, others would point out that this is freedom from artificial constraints, that ultimately, without saying who is right in that debate, right? We're not making statements of justice or what is ideal, that according to our definition of liberty, that the owner of the butcher shop is his right to free exercise would be covered in our index. Now I should say, and this is important for those who are interested, why don't we have anything about anti-discrimination law in our index? We did spend quite a bit of time, maybe Cam's Christmas break from teaching 4th grade, might have been spent largely on thinking about anti-discrimination law, and it's a bear. So turn to our FAQ if you would like more on that. But we found it so helpful to have to think through that, because it's given us a much better idea of what we mean by liberty. And so the final piece is that we have moved in stages through identifying where the data exists in the form of laws, fully, as much as possible, trying to capture the sorts of variation that exists in those laws. And so even though we don't use them directly in our index, we have lettered codes that reflect how states are safeguarding, or in some cases even why it is or how it is that they are not, in what ways we can see objectively in the law that the safeguards are not in place. And then we move from those codes to scores, ultimately scoring everything as a 0 or a 1, where a 1 is a safeguard and a 0 is a lack of a safeguard. And then ultimately the index is adding up our 11 safeguard scores for a state, dividing by 11 and getting a percentage score, which is our religious liberty in the state score. How is that? Too much math for
Fantastic.
10 minutes?
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Sam, I want to ask you a question, and in some ways perhaps the answer or a version of an answer might be implicit in the methodology that Sarah was just unpacking there. But if you look at one of the charts one of the tables that's in the packet, you'll see the 29 different items and the 11 safeguards that have been identified. Many of these items relate to traditional hot button issues having to do with sexuality or procreation. You might look at those and think, well, this is just a project, or religious liberty itself is just a concern of evangelical Christians. In what ways should we be thinking about religious liberty in the project and the touch points that are at these issues in our culture?
Yeah, I think a partial response to that concern is historical. And until roughly 20 years ago, claims of religious liberty were associated with non-Christian individuals and communities, and broadly speaking, were favored by liberals and progressives. Since that time, for a number of reasons that are probably obvious, they've become more closely associated with Christians and conservatives. But that shift happened relatively quickly, and I think that's a reminder that these principles are not inherent to any tradition or community or institution, but the way that they're expressed has a lot to do with the contemporary political environment, and that too can change. But more generally, and I think more importantly, the cases of conflict between conscience and state regulation or legislation are not confined to conservatives or Christians. So the issue that's most in the news over just the last few days concerns Hasidic yeshivas in New York State, which I learned from the rankings is last of 50. So there's plenty of room for improvement. So this is a vivid example that this is not only an issue of concern to Christians. More generally, and I think this is an area where there is welcome room to expand, there may be other criteria that can be included that would capture some of those dimensions. So I understand that the report does not assess the provision of halal or kosher food to prisoners or through other state facilities. That's a very clear issue of religious freedom that could be added, and it would be useful to know whether that changes the rankings in some way or not.
Yeah, thanks. Sarah, maybe I can give you a chance to talk a little bit about what these items more were included and what some of the constraints were and the factors that went into deciding what could be included then in this first iteration and not. And then, as a follow-up to that, how you arrived at a weighting scheme. Because there are different ways, once you get to those ones and zeros, of putting them together.
Yes, we had considered the scenario you suggest, exactly what's going on in prisons and institutions. One of the kind of inherent challenges, or it's really by design, that as a state-level index, we can't make use of really important for religious liberty law that is at the federal level, nor if it's at the more localized level. So it's my understanding, and I should have reviewed all my acronyms for today. RLUPA, Religious Liberty, Religious Land Use, Institutional Persons Act. Got it. Okay, thank you. I feel like I might just go to law school after this and make it official. But that establishes quite a bit at the federal level when prisons are involved. And so we would like to look at prison regulations at the state level. We're imagining, and have been told by the folks for some of the folks at First Liberty as well, that it's a bear. Maybe understandably, predictably. Prison regulations are not made as user-friendly as some other things maybe that other citizens are given access to. It's a little bit harder to measure those things. We suspect that there is some variation, and it may occur at the state level. We know there's variation at a local level, which is based on case counts, that people of a variety of religions find themselves in institutions where their religious liberty concerns are not of concern to the people who are in charge. So it's definitely on our list, and these are exactly the kind of suggestions that we need and want as we go forward. how what we land on turns into an index that is an aggregate score for each state is a function of the structure of our data. So I thought I'd say a little bit more about that. So in addition to Table 1 in your handout or in the report, you can kind of imagine our 11 safeguards illustrated here. One thing I wanted to point out, as you can see in column 3 of that table, is that some of these items are legislated in greater detail than others. So, for example, absentee voting, whether someone finds themselves with an alternative should their religious holiday fall on election day, it's either there or it's not. It's available for everyone. What it provides is a way to vote in an alternative space or time. And so there's only one item that's needed to capture the interstate variation on absentee voting opportunities. At the same time, when we look at, for example, the right of healthcare practitioners to refuse to participate in abortion, that is comprised of 7 different dimensions. So we call those 7 items. The first 3 would be who is protected. So does this extend to individual practitioners? Is it available to private hospitals and institutions? Is it extended even to public hospitals? The next 3 items would be what negative consequences are precluded by this law. Does it eliminate the possibility of civil liability, of criminal liability, of government repercussions like loss of license? And then the 7th item is whether these rights of refusal are limited in the case of medical emergency. And so I give those as 2 examples to suggest the data is a little bit complex in its form. These safeguards, some are comprised of multiple items and others are single items like RFRA. A state has one or they do not. Further, some of these topically are related, as I mentioned before, into what we refer to as groups. And so this really gave us an important question in our process of defining the aggregation process. Okay, so how are we going to make the index? And some of the principles we knew we wanted to bring to bear were simplicity, right? Because that's important for transparency, for people to understand what it is that we've done. And again, objectivity. What we don't want to do is step in and say, well, to us, RFRA seems so much bigger, right? Because this is really this sort of statement or indicative of these kind of values or critical in these particular spaces. Or, absentee voting, how many times a year do you vote? How important is this? Or, oh, it's the most important thing. It's the, root of all democracy. We didn't want to take a philosophical stance on any of these. So we knew we wanted simplicity and we wanted to step away from any kind of bias related to various philosophical understandings of these things. We imagine that those philosophical understandings probably vary across different religious belief systems, right? And so we're looking for a simple addition, right, summation of the scores. Now, at what level? Do we want to group things and weight each group equally, as demonstrated by the pie chart to the far left? Do we want to look at each of the 11 safeguards, weighting those equally, as in the center? Or do we want to look at each item, 29 of them, and weight those each individually as 1/29th of the overall score? So what we've illustrated here in the pie chart is each different color indicates a different group, so that you can see the prevalence of the group depending on how we weight. Is it according to group? Is it according to safeguard or item? And so if we go back to the example of absentee voting, that would be the area in dark blue in each of these charts. You can see that if we weight according to group, it's 1/6 of the overall index score. In the center figure, you see that dark blue, right, is 1/11th. And to the far right, again, weighting based on item, it's just 1/29th. So it does make a difference. How we weight matters, and that's why we want to be very clear ultimately what we land on. I think even maybe more illustrative of this, kind of quandary even, is the area in gray. That represents the abortion refusal rights. To the far left, you see it's 1/6, just like absentee voting. In the center, it is
4 safeguards of 11, right? So it's 4/11ths. It's larger than it would be if we weighted by group. But there are also a lot of items there and a lot of things that states have done if they're codifying those refusal rights. All the way to the right, if we were weighting according to items, there are 20 with respect to, I should say, not just abortion refusal, but all the healthcare provisions. 20 out of 29, more than 2/3 of the index would be made up of healthcare provision items. And so ultimately we've landed on the figure in the middle, not just because it's a middle ground, but actually because this is the way the laws kind of naturally present themselves. That there are provisions for who has their free exercise protected, from what, and in some cases that hangs together with multiple items in one safeguard or one provision covers it. It seemed that not only was this a good middle ground, but also a natural representation of what's going on in the laws. The last thing I'll say is because we're giving everyone access to the Excel spreadsheet, we hope many of you will take that data and run with it. Some of you will want to try out different weighting mechanisms, perhaps, and that will be a straightforward thing to do. We'd love to see your results or understand what it is you find appealing about your alternative approach, and we welcome that kind of conversation.
Excellent, thanks. Let me have a question about where we're going, perhaps. Sam, you mentioned some of these cases that are coming up now having to do with regulations about educational institutions. We've often in recent history seen a number of cases, some of them are active right now in the marketplace. Sam, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about where you think religious liberty issues are heading in the future, and Sarah, you maybe can talk about parts of that are already captured in the index and what some states have done on these issues, and whether you think that's an area also for potential growth for the index.
Yeah, I mean, I think as these examples show, claims and conflicts regarding religious liberty are not going to disappear and probably not going to decrease. I think they're the inevitable result not only of an increasingly pluralistic society, but also one in which regulation and administrative power over private actors and private institutions continues to increase. So the more activities are subject to administrative oversight, the more situations are going to arise where people are going to say, no, my conscience doesn't permit me to do that. One of my hopes for the index is that it will allow us to investigate and to understand better the consequences of some of the protections that it ranks. So a common objection to broad religious liberty protections is that there will be all of these terrible results. Children will be illiterate, there will be epidemics, citizens will be denied essential services. This is intentionally or otherwise a Trojan horse for the dissolution of the rule of law. One of the advantages of the index is first that it allows us to identify states that have relatively broad protections of religious freedom. And on that basis, we can then say, well, okay, what has happened now? Have these outcomes actually occurred, or are some of those fears misplaced? And my hunch, I'd like to find out if my hunch is actually true, is that the results are less dismal and disturbing than some of the critics have predicted. And if that turns out to be the case, that is reason for confidence that broad religious liberty protections are compatible with a genuinely pluralistic society. Again, rather than being special pleading for certain religious groups or a Trojan horse or an exception that ends up eating the rule of law, as I think the late Justice Ginsburg predicted.
Yes, likewise, we expect and we're already seeing things changing in state laws. We're tracking this for our 2023 edition. We're ready to confront those. I think one thing that I would draw out of Sam's remarks is that this data even gives us an opportunity to separate out, in an empirical fashion, what it means to offer people legal protections of free exercise, to live according to their conscience, without denying people, other folks, what they would consider good or even a right for themselves. I think actually the Dobbs decision is going to be an opportunity for this index to help folks make a case that one need not actually determine once and for all what is good or right to do with respect to abortion, but that we can very clearly say we can make these refusal rights available to healthcare practitioners. Right, those are two separate questions. And it's not that many of us don't have views on both those questions, but we can tease those apart. And where one of those questions might be more difficult to settle, perhaps the second question, how can we grant the right to conscience, can give us some politically feasible ways of living in this pluralist society. So one thing we see in the data, for example, is that the marriage and wedding items that popped up the earliest were in states where same-sex marriage was legal before the Obergefell decision. Now, I would love for researchers to dig more in, folks that do history and kind of the political context to dig into that more, but it was very difficult for us not to look at that and see, oh, maybe this is a political feasibility issue. In order to make advances in an area that maybe a majority of people found appealing and would therefore define as an advance, maybe we need to also consider the cost that incurs to others that we live alongside, and we need to find politically feasible ways to balance these concerns. And so I think that's a source of hopefulness, and because these concerns are not going to go away and the contention is not going to go away, learning about how that has unfolded in history and maybe planting some seeds for opportunities for that going forward, I think is a great potential for this project.
Just to add to that, briefly, I think one of the advantages of the transparency of this project and the systematic approach is that it allows us to avoid arguing about anecdotes, which so dominate these conversations. And it's in the nature of anecdotes that you can likely find one which is true and important that suits any political predisposition and is compatible with any conclusion. I think if we are to find feasible strategies for managing religious and other forms of pluralism, it's important to look beyond striking anecdotes, whatever they seem to show, and look for broader patterns that are favorable or not. And these data and the way that Sarah and her fellow researchers have made the data available will help to do that, even if people use the same data to draw different conclusions.
So we've got a couple minutes left, and I just want to give you both a chance to say something else that you hope to see arise out of this project or implications for religious liberty going forward. Maybe reiterate something that we've already touched on, or if there's anything that we haven't, that you haven't had a chance to say yet.
I guess I want to encourage anyone who has a creative thought of how to use this data to please do it, but I want to kind of highlight two particular ways that you might engage with this project. One would be to communicate with your elected officials and just inform them of what's going on. They have a lot of fish to fry, right? They might not actually know the full assessment of things. They might not understand, especially what's going on in neighboring states or states that they might consider their peers. And so for concerned citizens, I would encourage you to use what we've made available on the website and what we're attempting to make very user-friendly available to the folks that represent you and your concerns. And I'd also encourage my fellow researchers, whether you're a quantitative researcher or qualitative researcher, to join the conversation. Do the hard work of taking this data and correlating it with other measures, these positive attributes of a pluralist society that we would look for. Is it in fact the case that states where there are more religious liberty safeguards do in fact enjoy a more robust pluralism or even more intense religiosity of people within their particular belief systems? So I hope this project will spur some creative thoughts as to a way to do quantitative research or qualitative analysis as well that will help us step away from the anecdotes, as Sam suggested.
Yeah, to echo Sarah's last comment and to speak in my academic capacity for a moment, if there are any graduate students in the audience or who encounter the project, here is a data set ready for you to use. And it really is through transparent and systematic comparison, not only of quantitative data, but especially perhaps of quantitative data, that I think we can move this discussion beyond the conflict of anecdotes and vague principles and into a more productive phase of, once again, finding strategies that will allow us to live together as peacefully and productively as possible, which I take to be one of the pressing tasks of our time.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. By way of conclusion, let me just say a few words of thanks to so many who've been involved in the project and this event here. First, I want to say thank you to the First Liberty Institute, the home of the CRCD, its leadership, Kelly, Jeff, and Dave, whose vision and support for this project have really made it possible to come into existence. The CRCD leadership, Trey Dimsdale, Jillian Barr and Morgan Miller, who are all working here today and have made this project possible. Sam Goldman and his partnership, he's on the advisory council. There's a couple other advisory council members here present today as well. Thank you to them. The hosts here at George Washington and the Loeb Institute, the AV and event staff. We've thrown them some curveballs, including not turning on mics when they should be on, and maybe vice versa, I don't know. So thanks so much to them. Cam Zeller's here, and she's been mentioned a number of times. Drew McGinnis has done work on the print report. And especially thanks to the audience who's here, taking time out of their days to come both physically and via live stream. Just briefly, let me just say, for those of you who are here, in the folder on the right side is a preview of the report. It's just a little bit of a taste. The larger report is available right now on the website for download. You'll want to see the full report. It's 100+ pages, so it's got hopefully everything that you could want in terms of that transparency and the rigor of this project. And very finally, let me thank and invite you to also thank and congratulate Sarah Estelle, the director of this project, who has been its champion. As Trey said, a superhuman achievement to have accomplished this and produced this fine project over the last year. So thank you all, and thanks, Sarah. And with that, those of you who are with us, we're having a reception. You're invited to that outside. And please continue the conversation. We'll be out there. So thank you.